I want to welcome you back to another episode of what I branded Pivotal, since these interview style segments tackle impactful CPG industry topics and lessons from the business leaders that live it every day. It's no secret that a lot of social situations are still very much centered around drinking alcohol, and specifically beer. But how does that tradition potentially shift against the backdrop of more people becoming conscious of their physical and mental health? Drinking a non alcoholic beer was considered somewhat embarrassing and even stigmatized within the US market. But the beverage category has gone through a renaissance of late. In fact, over the last handful of years, I'd argue there's no other aspect of drinking culture that has enjoyed both the level of profound sales growth and huge cultural impact as non alcoholic beer. So, as my interest in this captivating beverage category has increased substantially, I've continually found myself searching out those independent upstart brand stories that connect with my own mindful drinking journey. And you'll hear about that connection when Jamie Fay explains what inspired him to create RationAle Brewing. Beyond talking through that RationAle Brewing strategic narrative, Jamie and I deeply analyze the driving factors and consumer behavioral trends behind the non alcoholic beer categorical evolution. Additionally, we talk through how RationAle Brewing, despite being the fastest velocity non alcoholic beer brand in the set, is staying disciplined as categorical hype grows. But furthermore, Jamie and I talk about his veteran CPG move to intentionally build RationAle Brewing in a strategic manner that's efficiently flexible enough to attack when opportunities are right, especially as the company kicks off its largest round of fundraising yet. Lastly, we pontificate a bit around how we see the future of zero proof beverages playing out long term. But without further delay, here is the recent conversation I had with my good buddy, Jamie Fay. All right, so it sounds like, at least for me, like every time there's this like fire brewing in like a CPG category, everyone seems to like run towards it like it's the second coming of this like mid 1800s like gold rush. And some might say that that is arguably happening in like the non-alcoholic beer space right now. But I pride myself on deciphering what's noise from who's actually making music, which I think RationAle Brewing is rocking out. Like I think it's definitely one of those things where you guys are making music. So it only makes sense for me to ask the brand's co-founder and to kind of steal. I got one of your taglines behind me, rip right into it. I think we need to do that. So Jamie, thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to join me.
Absolutely, dude. Stoked to be here.
So let's before we talk about, I guess, RationAle, let's talk a little bit around kind of the evolution of the category first, just to set the tone. Because I think there are a lot of people that understand what's going on, but I also think that there's, it's still, if we talk about the entire United States, that it's concentrated, I think, of where like people are really getting it at this current time. Because I remember, again, and I'm not going to date myself or anything, but like I remember there were people that used to drink like near beer, or like your parents would drink this, like if it was O'Doul's or something like that, and it was like out of like they didn't really enjoy it, they just kind of did it, and that's not where we're at now. There are, I would argue, probably like a number of different things going on. I could kind of layer that on, but I'm more interested to hear like where do you think from an evolutionary standpoint, like what's happened from that sleepy kind of boring, like kind of nobody wanted to talk about a category to now becoming this exciting space?
Yeah, that's a good question. Especially, I asked that question 3 years ago when we launched RationAle, because I was not drinking non-alcoholic craft beers. I wasn't drinking non-alcoholic beers at all. My only experience was with O'Doul's. And I think this goes back to what the persona was around what non-alcoholic beer represented and the persona behind it. So there's absolutely a lot of consumers that were drinking non-alcoholic beers for health reasons, wellness reasons, living a sober lifestyle. And it was a quiet category. There wasn't necessarily a lot of brands within the category, but there has been this massive shift over the past 3 to 4 years with consumers through COVID and post-COVID, really evaluating the relationship with alcohol and looking at ways to moderate. And it's not new by any means. If you take a look at over in Europe, many countries in Europe, their total beer sales represents 10 to 15%. is non-alcoholic beer. So it's already happening overseas. And so that trend has started to show itself in the US, but at a much smaller scale. To put it in perspective, in the US, it's the non-alcoholic beer category is still less than 1% of the category versus Europe, which is 10 to 15%. And the category in the US is the beer category is $120 billion. So you can imagine the size of this category where it could be in 2 to 3 years from now. We're projecting the category to hit $1 billion by 2026. But when I got into this 3 years ago, the category was only $150 million. It's been growing at 40%, and the craft segment's been growing at 400%. So this year in itself, it'll reach well over $600 million to $650 million.
Yeah, you touched on a few different things. I think generational shifts do a ton of things. I think arguably, that health and wellness mindset of younger consumers and trying to be more conscious or thoughtful towards where they're, kind of doing, if it's intoxication or alcohol consumption or something like that, like they're trying to be more thoughtful about that type of aspect of it. I also think, and this is something that's happened definitely in the non-alcoholic space, but I argue across almost every probably category over the last 10 to 15 years, was this like flavor like injection, or like the idea that like all of a sudden taste it became such an important part, and we can maybe thank the great people around, craft brewers, or we can thank the people at these flavor companies, or people that are in the R&D side of food and beverage, like these food scientists. Like these people have spent a lot of time on understanding that we love things to taste great, and there's an aspect that we want to enjoy things, and we want to be able to do that. And I argue that like there was that craft beer mentality that came to the non-alcoholic space, which probably is maybe like where you saw that,
Sure.
space or opening space, because like you said, you weren't drinking non-alcoholic beer. I'd assume you're based, or I think you were like at San Diego or something. There's a really great like craft beer scene there. Like you were probably enjoying, a few of those and saying like,
I totally.
Why can't we do this with non-alcoholic? Like what's going on here?
That's exactly it. I'm Canadian, so you've probably picked that up by now. So I've been drinking beer for a good chunk of my life, and I love drinking craft beer. I mean, I have a really good palate for it. And so when we started this journey, and I can share the founder story in a minute, but when we went down this journey, there was absolutely non-negotiable is that whatever we did was going to have the highest quality taste. It had to be something that I would be literally willing to swap out my ABV beers for, but I'd also be proud to walk into a party and throw a 12-pack in the fridge, or go out for a night of socializing and order at the bar. It was going to have to be phenomenal. And there's been some incredible R&D and technology that's taken place over in Europe that's made its way to the US. And then there's been some great brewers here in the US that jumped into the non-alcoholic category early over the last 5 years, and have done a great job raising the bar on the brewing and the R&D processes that are now putting out some really good high quality tasting beers that resonate with craft beer consumers that are now emerging and coming into this category along with mainstream alcohol consumers.
So let's talk about that, I guess, rationale for creating the brand. Like beyond obviously the liquid needed to taste great and needed to do those things, but like beyond that, what was kind of that point that you created this idea in your head that needed to come out in this artistic expression, I guess?
Yeah, well, I never would have thought I'd be running one of the fastest growing non-alcoholic craft beer companies, let alone founding it. And it all goes back to, I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for my experience from a professional side. So I've spent my last 30 years within consumer goods and worked and ran some larger global consumer good companies on the beverage and food side. So I was definitely set up with the right skills. But really the passion and purpose behind the category starts candidly from my personal story, is that when I grew up in Toronto, my dad was the youngest Superior Court judge in Ontario in his early 30s, and he was one of the top trial lawyers in the country. And I watched my dad completely implode his life and his career due to alcohol. And so through my teens and my 20s and my 30s, I watched him not able to moderate, and eventually alcohol succumb. And he ended up dying in a halfway house in downtown Toronto in his 60s. He had been debarred from the Law Society. He could no longer practice law, and he was in debt. And so he went from someone that had everything to offer to losing everything due to alcohol. And then my mother sadly also followed and died due to alcohol-related issues. And then my brother is doing a great job now, and he's a recovering alcoholic. And so, not that there's a weight over this company, but there was a weight on me. And that was like my family legacy. And I really didn't know what to do with it through a good chunk of my life. And so it was 3 years ago. I have two sons. One's now at the University of Alabama, and the other one's in his last year of high school. But my oldest son that was heading off to college to Alabama, he and I were sitting down on a Friday night with my other son, and they knew my family history. And this time I was a little bit more hardcore because he just got into a fraternity, and I wanted to have the conversation like one more time. And this time I was like really in his face around, hey, dude, you got to be really rational about how much you drink. You got to be rational about what you're drinking. You need to be rational when you're drinking. And my younger son, he was just trying to end the conversation because he'd heard it before, and he just sort of blurted out, why don't you just launch a beer company called RationAle? And that was like 10 o'clock on a Friday. We laughed about it. And then Saturday morning, I get up, and my younger son had gone online. He'd actually grabbed my credit card and registered the trademark RationAle Brewing and printed it off and left it on the kitchen table. And so that was, and I get goosebumps when I tell that story, but that was like how this company was founded in terms of the concept and the idea. And I knew nothing about the category other than I thought it was a brilliant name. And I went out to a local beer store, wine store, and bought every non-alcoholic beer in the shelf, brought it home, put it in my fridge, and I probably dumped like 90% of them out. They just like weren't resonating for me. And I thought there's got to be a better way to do this. There was a couple of there that I enjoyed, so I left them in my fridge. And then I realized I was drinking these over the course of the weeks. I'm like, shit, actually, I started to notice this change happening, and I wasn't looking to reduce my alcohol consumption, but it was already happening. And so you fast forward from the purpose behind this business to where we are today, and it was really built around wanting to put a high quality craft beer on the market, regardless if it had alcohol or not, that consumers could gravitate towards and make lifestyle changes for themselves. And candidly, post-COVID, which I didn't realize what I was launching at the time, there's been a huge evaluation for a lot of consumers that overdrank during COVID. And there's been this now conversation and evaluation around relationship with alcohol, and there's a lot of moderation taking place. And also the younger generation is just, they're not drinking alcohol the way our generation did. And so I think we just had the timing was perfect, and then a business with a lot of purpose behind it.
Yeah, the story resonates a lot with me because it was probably 5 or 6 years ago. I made a conscious decision just to kind of limit my alcohol. I'd never really personally had a problem. I mean, I was candidly, I was the person in college that binge drank and had a bunch of fun, and I did that into my 20s when I lived in downtowns of major cities. I enjoyed that lifestyle, but there were some things in my family similar to yours on both sides that just were patterns that I knew that I didn't want to repeat. And I started to see, at least and I was never the guy that, when I had a hard day of work, I'd come home and have a beer because that would relax me. I chose, another healthy addiction, I guess, of like working out or whatever. But I knew that like it could be easily switched, like I could easily become that because my professional life, building the consulting agency was really one of those situations where it became stressful and chaotic and everything. And you go, I know that there could be something or one day that like this switches over to a non-healthy, habit that could turn into an addiction or something like that, especially when it runs in the family. So I just made the conscious decision one day to go, I don't even want to create this problem. So at this point, maybe it's once or twice a year, I'll have, it's usually around, some celebratory or some type of situation where like, you're with a buddy that you haven't seen in years and you're reminiscing about it over a craft beer or something like that. But I resonate with that story because it honestly has been a shift in my lifestyle. So then I think about the consumers now, both on both sides, of the, older millennials, Gen X that are kind of being more conscious or mindful about what they're doing. They're not necessarily stopping completely or thinking about a life without, alcohol completely, but they're thinking about how much frequency, maybe how many within a day, like, and then, they understand the options that maybe they can put in there. It's no longer maybe needing a Coke in between or a water in between. Maybe it's adding a RationAle, or if it's available on premise, or it's, these things that you can kind of interchange. And then you mentioned around, probably your son's age and that generation, like they're actively, I think, questioning just
Yeah.
everything. They're being, this quote unquote, I think like sober curious mindset of like, they are kind of like questioning societal norms. Like we just grew up and I guess we're conditioned to think that alcohol was okay. Like it was fine. It was one of those situations where like, if it was marketing reasons or, whatever it was, like we were just like, oh, that's fine. Similar to probably the generation before with tobacco. And, these things were like,
Oh, for
it
sure, man.
comes where
Oh,
then
yeah.
now I think that generation's looking at alcohol and going like, no, like this
Oh,
isn't, why do we have to do this?
exactly. No, I mean my alcohol consumption's gone down by at least 75 to 80%. And it's just I've swapped it out and it's been so easy to do and I didn't even realize I was doing it until I started drinking really good non-alc beer. But I had to like dip my toe into being open to it. And having a good quality beer is what changes it all up if you have it in your fridge. What I used to do was that I would have like my 7% hazy IPA and then I would have my Pacificos. And so I would have a couple of nice hazy IPAs, and then my pacer beer was my Pacifico, but my Pacifico is still 5%. I'm drinking it like water. I'm like, so like my first step was, well, I'm going to still have my hazy IPAs, but I'll have my non-alc beer, and then I just only put the non-alc beer in the fridge, and then all of a sudden I was having the non-alc beer, and I was realizing like I was still satisfied because I was having it with my tacos on a Tuesday night, or was having it after a long day on a Thursday. I could have this beer and be fulfilled, and then I could save when I wanted to have some alcohol for the moments and when I wanted to enjoy it, and it made sense. So the consumer, the habit that has changed, and also generational. Like I remember my mom when I was in my late teens and early 20s, she'd be recommending. I'd be going out for an interview, and she'd say, "Well, after the interview, you should shake his hand and take him out for a beer and get to know him." Like that's what you were doing. You go out and have alcohol and socialize and get to know each other. I mean, that's what I grew up in. And so I know you grew up in a similar situation. Well, the generation now of my kids, they see the destruction really that's happened with a lot of family members and friends with alcohol, but they also are aspirational in the type of life they want. And they know that alcohol is going to hold them back. So there's just so much awareness around it now. And now it's actually cool to not drink. Like it's socially inappropriate to get shit faced at a party. You just don't do that anymore. So, I mean, that's the whole thing is like, how do you bring the conversation that we're having to the forefront, which is actually going to our brand is what we're doing is we're leading the conversation around alcohol and not around the wellness. We're leading about, you can go out and have a rad time and still enjoy yourself in all these incredible occasions. And you can have a great non-alcoholic craft beer. And yes, the benefit is that you don't have a hangover the next morning. You're not feeling like shit. But we're building a brand that really resonates with a broad consumer base, not a wellness platform.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that about the brand side that I think is important because I do think there is a good amount of the people in the non-alcoholic beer space that have taken this kind of like, I don't know, like a little bit of pretentious, like kind of take on it, or like it just seems like it doesn't necessarily fit or can be interchanged with the culture before that. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
there's still some transition that needs to happen. I mean, there's still a big drinking culture. There's still people that are obviously in college, having a blast like we probably did and whatever. But like, so because of that, because we're in between this shift, I think what you guys have done by like creating, there's an edge to like the tonality of your brand. That like the cans are designed in a certain way, the packaging is designed in a certain way. Like when you made the comment around, like you should feel proud or you shouldn't feel weird about having the can in your hand or putting the 12 pack in the fridge while everybody else maybe is drinking. Like you should, like it should feel similar to that. Like you should still be able to like have some of that connection to it, because I do think like taking and just like hardlining it and going completely to this like holier than thou kind of pretentious view, it turns off a lot of people. Like you can still, like you said, you could be rad. You can, crush life and do all these things in an edgy, cool, exciting way without having to, drink a 12 pack of whatever alcohol. Like you could do these things, but it doesn't have to look lame or look like your parents, like, zero version of like their brands. You know what I mean? Like you can have a brand that's cool and you feel like is actually an accessory to you. Like you feel proud to have that be a part of you and it tells something about you.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Is like we're building this brand to be inclusive, and this is not an aspirational brand at all. We are an inspirational brand because we're wanting to inspire those that are sort of earlier in their journey right now. Like we will be the gateway for them into exploring non-alcoholic beverages, the whole category. But it has to start with something that connects in with them emotionally, and so we're building this brand around it looks and feels more like a tequila brand or a regional craft brand, or to the far end of how Liquid Death is so in your face around their marketing standpoint. We're not going to that extreme, but we're wanting to connect with consumers where they feel like this is something that represents me and my lifestyle. And so we're not pigeonholing ourselves into a very specific wellness platform that a majority of the non-alcoholic beer brands today are sort of going after and messaging, which makes sense. But that's only one sub-segment. There's this whole other broader group of consumers that are coming in that may not be running marathons. They may not be playing pickleball, and they're sitting on their couch watching football. They're going out to the bar, eating fries and a burger. And those are the people that we're bringing in with this brand because they connect with the brand on an emotional level. But most importantly, the beer tastes freaking good, right? And that's why they're keeping it in their fridge, or that's why they're ordering at the bar, or that's why they're showing up at a party with a 12-pack. And by the way, anytime I go to any social settings and I bring our beer and I put it in a fridge or in a cooler, people always are gravitating towards it because, to your point, it's that social inclusion. And so now it's cool. Yeah, I'll have one of your beers. They're doing me a favor by having one. And then I see them go back and have another and have another. And then they're walking out at the end of the party or the end of the barbecue or the end of the night, and they've had maybe 4 beers, and 3 of them were RationAles and one of them was an ABV. But it's like we're building this really cool brand around it.
Yeah, and that's why I kind of feel like, a lot of the attention gets put on, I think, obviously generational change creates a lot of, big effects across everything. It creates that, opportunity or whatever. But I argue that like today, the true opportunity in the space is more what you're talking about and what resonates with both of our lifestyles of like more that idea of like being just mindful and having options that fit into how we're already integrating these products, but in a more health conscious way or whatever that is. It's not necessarily that we are thinking about taking everything out. We're just thinking about having and applying this in kind of an interchangeable or having the option to do that. Like that's, to me, incremental 1% of this big, like you mentioned, $130 billion US category. Like, you take incremental percentages and you build those things over time, those make massive waves. It's like, maybe it's a bad analogy, but I also think about this as like the plant-based lifestyle where people like vegan and vegetarian lifestyles are not going to like fundamentally like blow up to become this like humongous percentage. It stayed pretty relative over the last few decades, but the flexitarian lifestyle where people are just making more conscious decisions and saying, you know what, I'll add a little bit more plant here. I'll try to go plant-based ingredients here or whatever that it is. Like those just incremental things on big, huge categories make huge waves. So it's like aligning yourself in the reality of that seems more than, like I said before, this more holier than thou pretentious, like we're going to go after the people that are choosing sobriety, which is great. But also I think that maybe level never, gets to a point where it's, the vast majority of Americans, or at least maybe not for the next 25 or 30 years, but you're building a business today. So like, how do you do that? You have to do it where like the opportunity is at.
Yeah, well, and if you take a look at, the bets have been placed. So all of the major global beer companies are all putting a stake in the sand, stating that 20% of their total portfolio is going to be non-alcoholic beer and beverages. The train has left the station, and the largest one, obviously, Heineken 0.0 was way ahead of this, and they've invested a ton of money globally into helping build this category out, as has the leader in our category, which is Athletic. They've done an incredible job investing and helping build this category out. So it's going to take time, but there's no reason why this category can't be a $10 billion category in 10 years from now. It could be less than 10%, but that's how many consumers are coming in. And then it's going to be a matter of what are the brands that are going to resonate with the consumers. The quality of the beer continues to get better as all tides rise. More consumers are putting the demand out there. Retailers are now expanding their shelf space and taking away space from the alcohol beer, and they're now opening up their space to the non-alcoholic beer. Whole Foods, a great example is that Athletic is the largest beer from a revenue standpoint for Whole Foods for their total beer category. So a non-alcoholic beer is their number one beer. So consumers, the demand is there. Now it's just a matter of making sure that the brands are available to consumers, but you have to have brands that all have a point of difference, because to your point, there's a larger subset of consumers that are coming in and you need to attract them in. And it's those that are coming in, they need to have the confidence to have the trial. What we're building is a community of what we refer to as Mavericks. So we don't have brand ambassadors, we have brand Mavericks. And Mavericks are the ones that have the confidence and the disruptors. They're doing things their way. And they're the ones that we see leading these communities that are now dipping their toe into exploring non-alcoholic beer, is that we want Mavericks that are going to be engaging with them. So they're the ones that are confident enough to bring the 12 packet and put it in the fridge. They're the ones that are confident enough to order a round of RationAles at a bar when their other buddy may have ordered the round of tequila. And they're out there, but we got to bring them in. And so we're supporting them and helping build this category with our unique approach.
Now, we were talking about something off camera, and I want to bring it into the conversation because I think we were touching on some good things here. And I'm going to say things like, there's category hype, but I think not necessarily there's demand that meets that hype. I don't think necessarily that this is a long-term secular trend. I don't think this is something like, I say the word hype more from just the word, not necessarily that it has a negative connotation to it. But there is a lot of that happening. And then for you, having the background in CPG, and you understand that there is an element that growing too fast, too quickly, and there's limitations because you're still creating physical products that need to be moved around. Arguably you're moving water around, mostly water, and that's costly. And it's one of those situations where there are limitations unless you go out and raise, an insane amount of capital and try to blast past it. You have to stay disciplined. And I think that what you mentioned earlier, you said, there's good things and bad things about not having experience before you get into this. But I believe at least currently, what's important is you understand how to build the machine, and the machine needs to be able to start understanding efficiency. And it's not that you have to turn the machine on to full blast. It's that you have to know that the machine has the flexibility or the optionality to do that, because you're trusting that you've set the tone across the board. If it's your sales and marketing strategies, it's your, distribution agreements, it's maybe some of the technology behind your business, it's your sampling. You have to understand how to build that system together, or some type of flywheel, because if not, when say you do raise a significant amount of capital, it'll never actually get the spinning or the effect, because you didn't actually understand how these things fit together. So I feel like you having that background actually provides that framework or that understanding of I have to build this machine. I have to think about my business now as being as profitable as it can be, also understanding which growth opportunities are good or bad, and how are my business as a whole, how is that all linked together? Is it multiplying, or am I creating resistance or whatever? And I think your background obviously provides you the opportunity to understand those things over somebody that maybe has no idea. And they're just feeling their way out, and maybe they hit on something great and they're an outlier, but they tend to miss on this piece that's really important in a, arguably a challenging marketplace right now.
Yeah, I mean, that's a loaded comment, a lot in there. I'd start with just the fact that without the experience that I had in 30 years in consumer goods, there's no way that I would have been able to have navigated these past 3 years, especially the past 12 months. And I will say the raising of capital is extremely challenging right now. And so anyone that is investing into food and beverage brands and within the non-alcoholic space, they are looking for a leadership team that really understands the importance of having a sustainable, profitable, scalable business model. When we launched RationAle, and we always have been cash strapped in the sense that we've never gone out and raised a large quantity of money. We've been always operating our business on 3 to 4 months worth of cash and continually proving the brand out and getting some more cash in. And we've done that diligently, and I'm grateful that we've gone through that process, because we didn't overextend ourselves with any investors and grow too fast. And I will tell you, it is extremely tempting to want to go scale nationally, because at the end of the day, it's all about top line sales. And so if you can get the top line sales and you have a profitable operating model where you show the ability to have the gross margins, but more importantly, the EBITDA, you can scale and be profitable quickly. However, you got to prove your brand out first. And so we launched RationAle in Encinitas in Southern California. We knew it was a hotbed for non-alcoholic beer. Over 40% of consumers 3 years ago were those that were drinking non-alcoholic beer on the West Coast. So we launched it where we knew we could go deep. And our strategy has been, we talk openly about this, is that we want to go a mile deep before we go a mile wide.
Yeah.
But also going a mile deep versus a mile wide still requires investment, because you still have to invest into your distribution model. You have to invest into your brand building. You have to invest into having a sales organization and salespeople in place, and you have to invest into basically running the company. So we've chosen to go really deep into the West Coast. The non-alcoholic, and actually the beer category in itself is unique, is that the distributors really hold the keys to the success, because they are the ones that are the wheels to the retailers. They are the ones merchandising the shelves. They have the relationships with the category buyers. So it takes time to build a business and get the consistent revenue and the velocities to gain the confidence from distributors to bring you on their trucks. So focusing on the West Coast has been a really good strategy for us. And especially now in this capital market, as we look to prove this brand out, we spent a lot of time securing our distributor model, securing really strong retail chains that we can prove the velocity out in the brand, and then show the ability to scale this thing so that when we are ready and we're fortunate and grateful enough to bring in a larger check, when we go deploy those funds, we'll be able to deploy them into markets with a playbook that's proven itself out on the West Coast. And it goes back to my original comment, is that it's very tempting to go chase top line revenue to be able to get those bottom line EBITDAs, so that you're already showing your profitability. But if you do that too soon, it may not be sustainable 2 to 3 years down the road. So one of the most important components for us has been securing a partnership from a brewing and manufacturing standpoint that allows us to have healthy margins, so that when we do want to deploy and scale, that we're ready in a very sustainable model. And we also have strong partnership with distributors that are going to be ready to take us on, because they've seen what we've done in other markets. But it is a very competitive category right now. There's a lot of exciting new brands hitting the shelves. And the question will be, is the brands that really have a sustainable operating model that will be able to sustain the growth opportunities that are there, because all of us see it and we're all taking advantage of it. But many of us may not have the right operating models to survive it. And so we at least at RationAle, we're really battening down the hatches to make sure that we have a sustainable plan in the next 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, I think about, you made the comment around, how important distributors, DSD is. And
yeah.
I've heard, from various people over the years, and they always kind of throw out this idea that like the non-alcoholic beer space doesn't have to operate within the 3-tier system. And because of that, you can go, and do direct to consumer. You can do all these types of things that are maybe not available to typical beer distributors or beer makers or brands. And that is true. And I think that in itself has some powerful mechanisms that can unlock some things for you. But I spend a lot of time in energy drinks, and it's kind of, I think about it in a very similar way, where energy, most of the category, 70 odd % goes through convenience stores. Obviously, most of that is going through DSD, but yet they could still sell, obviously on Amazon or on direct to consumer, but they're probably going to break even or not make much money. But it opens up at least the opportunity, I think, nationwide for somebody to try your product that maybe you don't currently have a DSD in, but it's not necessarily this like huge competitive advantage that like all of a sudden unlocks massive opportunity, because again, you're moving around water and doing that in a parcel shipping way is typically not the easiest or the cheapest way to do those things. So like, it's still really around this DSD distribution side of things. And again, obviously there's different models based on if it's grocery or whatever, maybe you kind of utilize some different distribution models. But I think that to me is something that like I'm thinking about as a commonality. Another commonality that I'm thinking about is, again, I cut my teeth in the supplement industry, and the supplement industry, as people might know, is that it's very like, it has a seasonality to it. Like when January 1st comes around, it's new year, new, me type of situation. All of a sudden, everybody has resolutions and they want to become, whatever. And you have this humongous group of people that are interested all of a sudden into health and wellness. They're interested into applying new routines and regimens and all this kind of stuff like that. So you have this natural like influx of people that are in consideration or discovery phase, and brands, spend a ton of money to attract as much. But over time, it usually, whatever that growth rate is off of January, from December to January or whatever, it usually kind of settles in at like where that level's at. And what I found interesting, because I hadn't looked at it until recently, was a similar effect, mostly because of this like dry January effect with the non-alcoholic space kind of pushing, that is that you have people that all of a sudden, get into this new habit. They try a bunch of these new products, and throughout the rest of the year, you have people that, stick with it and enjoy it, and they tell other people, and more people come in, but then other people drop off because maybe it wasn't for them or they want to go back to their original lifestyle. But the point I'm trying to make here on this one is like, again, around thinking about like growth cycles of the category, is thinking about it as like, okay, just because you saw, from December to January, like 70% growth, you start to model in your head, oh, everything's going to be that high, but you don't realize like it kind of settles in at a certain rate that like can give you false signals. Like I started to see, and again, maybe I'm making a bad point around disparate data points, but like in my mind, I think about them in similar ways of like, you, again, not staying disciplined, making sure you're not getting ahead of, one data point because you're like, this is exciting or whatever. And then starting to like deploy your assets in a too aggressive way that then is ahead of like where the market's at. Like you have to kind of wait sometimes for the market to get to where it needs to be.
Yeah.
There's a patience element to this because, wherever we said before, there's an incrementality. People are changing habits. Like it's going to be much bigger tomorrow than it was today, or bigger than, a year from now or 10 years from now. It's going to be much bigger, but it does take some discipline in the short term to understand like how fast and hard do you push this for us to work within our system.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I look at its organic compounded growth of consumers coming into the category, because to your point, there's these moments in time, especially through the holiday season and then into January, where there's this high influx of consumers coming in. And this is going to continue to happen for the next 10 years. Consumers are coming in for the first time trying, and then, small percentage of them are leaving, but more and more are staying. And so the more and more that stay are the ones that are then adding it into the repertoire. Their habits change. Like where I was 3 years ago to where I am today is dramatically different. The amount of non-alcoholic craft beer, I'm like 9-1 now on my beer intake on NA beer versus AB beer, where 3 years ago was probably flipped. So that's going to happen with this category, because as this category compounds every month with more consumers coming in, more staying, and then less leaving, but that month on top of month on top of month on top of month, you go through another summer with more non-alc beers in the coolers, more on premise, like more non-alcoholic beers being available at restaurants, in pubs, in movie theaters, in music venues. I mean, now when I go to restaurants, I'm shocked if they don't have at least 2 non-alcoholic beers on the menu. Well, 2 years ago, they wouldn't have any. If they did, it was O'Doul's. And nothing wrong with O'Doul's, but now there's like a ton of really good options out there. So you're right. I mean, this is going to be a compounded growth from consumer heads coming in and staying over the next 3 to 5 to 7 years. And that's how we're going to end up where you have the 10 to 15% of the category over in Europe. That could become a 5 to 7% in the US. And there's no reason why it couldn't be 10% in 10 years from now. It just takes time.
Yeah, I think that data point you shared earlier around, AB InBev saying, 20% of the total share over the next couple of years, they believe is going to move over to non-alcoholic. I mean, I think that's telling, because if they could have an ego and say like, that's not going to be the case, because they want to keep their, most valuable IP as strong as possible by not signaling that there's some change. They could, not necessarily say those data points, but by them saying it, you have to not only believe that that's true, but also I would even like ramp it up a little higher, because like I feel like they're naturally probably going to discount that a little bit to kind of like save their face a little bit, because they still obviously want to sell a ton of Bud Light and sell a ton of Budweiser and a ton of those beers that like they don't have to acknowledge that. And I wanted to get your take on this. This is kind of just a kind of random question, but like I think about another big alcohol kind of company, and I think about more from they have their hand in a little bit of everything, like a Constellation Brands, and they have their beer and their wines and their spirits. Like in 5 to 10 years, like is there a non-alcoholic version of that like builds a cross portfolio, like having some non-alcoholic spirits or some non-alcoholic beer brands, some non-alcoholic cocktails or wines or whatever? Like, is that something that you see as a reality, or is it just each one of these are going to add their pieces to their existing ones? Like, I think the second part I just said is definitely true because it's already happening. But I do think like that the other one, I'm kind of curious to see if somebody bundles this up into like, the non-alcoholic version of Constellation Brands.
Yeah, it's already happening. I take calls every couple of weeks on groups that are seeing the future. Beverage executives that have been around the block enough times that they've seen this play out. It's happened in the natural organic food category, and it's going to absolutely happen within beverage because there can be one conglomerate that's going to have a division that gobbles up a bunch of portfolio brands across beer, wine, and spirits, because this is where the consumer is going. And it's not just about North America. This is globally. It's happened. And so that's what's going to make this so interesting is that what are the smaller brands today that are out there that eventually will be the acquisition targets of these larger corporations, because they can only put out so many non-alc versions of their own brands that resonate with their core consumer to go capture the other consumers that are out there that may not be in their core portfolio. They're going to want to go out and acquire the smaller brands that are up and coming that they can bring into their portfolio, because it's going to benefit their alcohol portfolio, but also scale out their AB portfolio. 86% of non-alcoholic beverage sales today, 86% is beer. 14% is wine and alcohol. So you're going to continue to see, I think, more beer brands coming in, and eventually there'll be acquisitions within the NA beer category, which I think, to your point, there'll be the beginning of some forming of some divisions that are purely NA. But going back to Constellation and the bets that all of these companies are placing right now, they want to at least start with their core NA versions. So like Corona 00, I think I just read yesterday, they're the official sponsor of the Olympics. Don't quote me on that, but I think I read that. Heineken 00, they're spending $55 million in sampling this quarter alone in the US. So when you just think of the marketing dollars that are getting shifted from these big beverage companies into their non-alcoholic portfolio of their core brands first, they want to secure their role with their core brand and bring their core consumer that drinks the AB version into their zero version. And then they're going to have the portfolio on top of that they'll bring. So yeah, the next 5 years, there's going to be consolidation and acquisition. Absolutely. And there's independents out there that are now trying to create their own beverage businesses that are purely NA.
Yeah, and I think for brands in your position, it's like, obviously got to have a great liquid, but beyond that, it's like, that distinctiveness of the strategic narrative, that brand that actually creates some emotional attachment, those things that like are arguably what's defensible or what's unique and distinct or valuable in the CPG world is some of that. So like when, they don't need a lot of times if it's going to be an AB or if it's going to be a Constellation or something like that, they have the massive, powerful IP that they're going to move to 00, like that can capture a ton of just volume, but they need the the craft beer equivalency, the ones that actually have those unique connections with the consumers that they can't touch sometimes or whatever. And it's just natural that I think that they're going to be looking at brands like yours. I think, you guys will be a great, selection for whoever, when that kind of process starts to heat up a little bit more. So Jamie, I know you've been talking for a while. I wanted to just thank you for the conversation, the time, everything like that. This was excellent.
Yeah, that was awesome, man. I love the conversation. I mean, I could spend another 2 hours shooting the shit with you. So let's do this again soon.
Yeah, would love that.
I hope you enjoyed this YouTube video. If you did, consider hitting that like button to support me. Also help me get to my new short-term goal of 4,000 subscribers by hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to see you join me on this journey, but we need to fix the fact that slightly more than 90% of you that are watching this YouTube video right now are not subscribed to my channel, and that makes me extremely sad. But I do want to thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next one.